is India. Why I'm telling this? Because you look at three macroeconomic variables. One is organized sector employment. Second one is manufacturing sector's contribution to GDP. Third one is the external sector performance, particularly reflected in trade balance and current account balance. If you look at organized sector employment, which accounted for about 8% of the total workforce, in 1991 accounted for hardly 7% by 2011. And if you look at manufacturing sector's contribution, which was about 17%, 16 to 17% in 1991, has remained more or less the same since then. And we all know on the trade front as well as the current account balance front, the position is actually deteriorating year by year. Then what all these have to do with startups? That is the question that one might wonder. In fact, if we promote startups, particularly product startups, they have the ability to generate organized sector employment, and they have the ability to increase the contribution of manufacturing sector to the GDP of the country, and they have the ability to contribute to the country's exports, therefore trade balance, and therefore current account balance. And that is where I find the value, economic value of startups. Now, if we have to promote startups on a considerable scale, then we need to generate entrepreneurship accordingly. But if we have to promote entrepreneurship on a considerable scale, then we have to really understand or strengthen the economic ecosystem for entrepreneurial startups. Now, if we have to really strengthen the startup ecosystem, then we have to understand what is there in the existing ecosystem and what are the critical components, how do they interact, and what do these components or what does this ecosystem lack in the current perspective. Next. Now the next issue is, why should we look at Bangalore? I'll take a couple of minutes. Now India, in the global startup landscape, India has been recognized as one of the potential sources of high-tech startups. That is primarily for two reasons. Of course, the ASCOM recognition has already been talked about. Now, there are two reasons. One is there has been an enormous increase in the number of professional education institutions in the country. Two, the number of MNCs entering into the country and operating out of India, that also has increased considerably. Now, these have primarily led to the increase in the potential of India as a source for high-tech startups. Now, coming to Bangalore, I would like to elaborate it a bit more. Prior to 1991, Bangalore was considered a pensioners' paradise. In 1985, Texas Instruments entered into Bangalore. Thereafter, the emergence of a series of IT firms led or enabled Bangalore to get the recognition as the IT capital of the country. But more importantly, in 1991, when we opened up the economy for foreign direct investment, all kinds of MNCs started getting into the country. In fact, John Dunning has broadly classified MNC investments under four different heads: resource seeking, market seeking, efficiency seeking, and strategic asset seeking. While a good number of MNCs come under the category of resource seeking and market seeking investments, the nature of MNC investments flowing into Bangalore actually was in the form of efficiency seeking. Now, how did they seek efficiency? A good number of MNCs increasingly started locating their R&D centers in Bangalore. By 2000, more than 100 R&D centers of MNCs were operating in Bangalore. Not surprisingly, by 2001, Bangalore got the recognition as one of the 46 global hubs of technological innovation. That actually laid the base for the emergence of startups, which subsequently led to the recognition of Bangalore as the startup capital of India. So today, if you see any international literature on startups, if there is no mention to Bangalore, it will be a surprise. So increasingly, more and more journalists and international organizations identify Bangalore as one of the hotspots for high-tech startups. I have made reference to two of them here. Cullen, who is an American journalist, he has identified Bangalore as one of the 9 international startup hubs outside the USA. And we are all familiar with the Startup Genome report. The global ranking has improved from 19 to 15. Now, according to the government of Karnataka, also other sources support it, substantiate them. Bangalore accounts for the highest share of startups in the country. Now, that is why we would like to focus on Bangalore in our presentation. Next one. Let me briefly make reference to some of the features of startups. Now, startups, what are they? They are all new ventures with no previous history of operations. They are not the acquired ones. They are not the inherited ones. They are not spin-offs. So that is why they suffer from the liability of newness, since they are unfamiliar and without any precedence. And in fact, startups can emerge in any sector, particularly in the industry and services domain. And they would include both products and services. And in most cases, they are technology-based or technology-using. And in some cases, they would have emerged out of newly created technologies, or they themselves might repeatedly create new technologies. The last but the most important one, in most cases, the promoter invariably would have gained the domain knowledge of business with the required technological competence. And this has ignited primarily from the self-motivation and passion for a new idea implementation. Next. While startups have deserving credentials for promotion, they are also known for a high rate of infant mortality. They have a very high or a very limited rate of survival and growth. This has been observed in the international context. Now, that is because they face innumerable number of challenges. Some of these have been referred already. They have scarce financial resources. They have to confront skeptical customers. Sometimes even accessing appropriate human resources is also a challenge. And inadequate or inaccessible or prohibitively high-cost support services. So all these virtually difficult, make the life of a prospective entrepreneur difficult to give shape to his idea and take it to the market. Now, if we have to support startups to cope with these challenges, then we must understand what are the factors which influence the emergence, stability or sustenance and success of these startups. So literature broadly classifies these factors as internal and external. Now, what are these internal factors? Internal factors are primarily related to the founders, their background, their experience, their exposure, their social capital, and their ability to exploit this social capital. While that is largely given. Whereas the equally important, rather the more important one is external to them. Now, what is external? The external we refer to the ecosystem in which they operate. Next. When we say the ecosystem, it is largely the regional ecosystem that matters for them. The regional ecosystem matters because mostly the government policies are largely region-specific. They are largely region-specific rather than industry-specific. For example, in the case of India, we have mostly state industrial policies which are much more significant rather than industry-specific policies. Now, in our context, two of my students have carried out a study mainly to look at what factors have enabled the emergence of high-tech startups, high-tech clusters in India. And the study has concluded that it is the availability of financiers, particularly VC funds, critical mass of high-tech businesses and skills, penetration of the internet, and others have played an important role in the emergence of high-tech clusters for startups such as Bangalore and Hyderabad, among others. Thus, it is the strength of the regional ecosystem that would matter. Next. Now, a strong regional ecosystem, it has both micro benefits and macro benefits. Micro benefits in the form of promoting innovations and strengthening the regional business environment, and macro benefits in the form of promoting the growth of gross domestic product and employment. Now, that is why, of late, world's most dynamic areas have started looking at the ecosystem, and they have started assessing the ecosystem, its capability. Now, the other important issue in the context of ecosystem is these ecosystems are neither identical nor replicable. The best examples are Silicon Valley and Israel. They are not identical, and they are difficult to replicate. Then what do we do? It's important to understand what are the critical components of an ecosystem for promoting successful startups. If we are able to identify and understand the critical components, then it is possible to promote a unique ecosystem with respect to each country. Now, That is the other important issue. Now, but while promoting the ecosystem, it is also important to know that our ecosystem is dynamic. Any ecosystem is dynamic. It is dynamic because they change in terms of people, in terms of organizations, and in terms of environments. Now, why does it happen? In most cases, this startup ecosystem, they attract talent from diverse corners of the country, or maybe that is why we find different ecosystems within a country, though they all operate under the same macroeconomic environment. Next. Now, the issue is, what are the important stakeholders or critical components in an ecosystem? I have made reference to two of the studies, though at least 30 to 40 papers we have referred, and they all have looked at the ecosystem components. Now, Foster and Shimizu, they have identified three important components or stakeholders in an entrepreneurial ecosystem: entrepreneurs, large companies, and government. It is very easy to understand the role and functions of the entrepreneur because they form the central focus of attention, and they always look for passive accessible markets, human resources, and finance, the three of the functional areas of management. But in addition, entrepreneurs also play multiple roles. They might be mentors, they might be inspirers, they might be investors, they might be new founders, or they might be even new employees for other startups, particularly when they fail. And large companies, they have the potential role to provide important leverage because they, in most cases, are early adopters of the startup product startups. And government policy, it can break or make an ecosystem. Now, Anjum, in the context of the US, has identified 7 vital components in the ecosystem for startups: suitable infrastructure, government support, network of universities and institutions, access to a big market, talent pool, availability of funds, and entrepreneurial spirit. But the issue is here, though many empirical researchers have looked at startup ecosystem, its components and all, not many have actually tried to understand the gaps. Now, if an ecosystem has gaps or inadequacies, even if they promote startups, these startups are unlikely to be successful. Now, that is the issue. That is why it's important to understand, to make an assessment of the ecosystem in terms of its components, in terms of its interactions, and in terms of the gaps. Next. So, Motoyama and Watkins of the Kaufman Foundation, they have identified 3 research gaps in the startup ecosystem literature. 1, past studies focused on identifying the key elements but hardly analyzed the connections between them. 2, past works focused on holistic framework, which often ended up with an inclusive approach to any possible elements, and in the process, an evaluation in terms of the relative importance of these elements is missing. 3, past studies lack the power to analyze the evolution of ecosystems. Next. Now, it is with this background that I would like to mention 3 objectives of my presentation today. What are the vital components of the ecosystem for startups in Bangalore? 1, how do these components play their role and interact with one another as a means of promoting startups? 2, what are the key inadequacies in the ecosystem for startups in Bangalore? 3, next. So what do we do? The scope and methodology, the study is confined to startups and the key components or stakeholders of the ecosystem as we understood from the literature for startups in Bangalore. Now, we have adopted Delphi technique, and as part of this Delphi technique, we have identified about 40 plus stakeholders. Precisely, we have interviewed 42 selected stakeholders during August, November 2015. It's pretty recent. Now, we started with an open-ended questionnaire and interacted with these experts, spending about 1 to 1.5 hours of time. 2 of the Delphi experts are here, Mr. Kiran Bhattadpur and Mr. Sampath Iyengar. Now, based on these responses, the key components of the ecosystem for startups, their interactions and inadequacies are described. Next. Now, this is the distribution of startups. Primarily, we have looked at startup entrepreneurs because they, as I have already told, and we all know, they form the nucleus or the central focus of the attention. 12 of these 42 are startup entrepreneurs. We interacted with the representatives of India Electronic and Semiconductor Association, Manufacturers Association of Information Technology, and TiE Bangalore. We interacted with 5 mentors, 4 academicians who are into either entrepreneurship research or who are into the promotion of incubation centers within their institutions. And we have visited one co-working space and one accelerator. And we also interacted with one prospective startup owner and one startup owner whose startup is actually undergoing incubation in IBAB Bangalore. We also visited on common facility provider, interacted with the CEO. We interacted with 5 of these financiers covering seed funders, angels, VCs and PEs. We have interacted with 3 MNCs who promote directly or indirectly startups. And we have interacted with 2 exited entrepreneurs. One, their venture failed. 2, he exited on his own due to some other reasons. And we interacted with 2 media correspondents, and also we interacted with the Secretary of ITBT Government of Karnataka. Next. What did they identify? This is what the critical components as mentioned by them. Entrepreneurs and sources of entrepreneurship, technology as well as business mentors, investors covering seed funders, angel investors, VCs, private equities, government policies and institutions, they can be supportive or neutral, support agencies, co-working space, accelerators, incubators, educational and research institutions for talent pool for entrepreneurship as well as personnel, large domestic and foreign companies, they can be nurturers of startups or early adopters of the products of startups or acquirers of startups at a later stage. Common facility centers or support service providers, they are either design centers or laboratories for biotech firms. Supportive culture for risk-taking and experimenting new ideas due to relatively smooth cross-cultural migration that Bangalore is facilitating and experiencing, and it is steadily improving. And scope and size of the market, local market is good enough, but in some cases they are pretty well linked with the global market as well. Quality of life, good weather has been identified by many of them, though it is getting polluted, and infrastructure is deteriorating, and supportive media. Now, the more important one is how are they linked? Now, I have broadly classified, the stages of the life cycle, divided them into 3. Now, the first one is the sources of entrepreneurship. Right? MNCs, it would emerge from MNCs, it would emerge from large firms, domestic, it would emerge from human startups, it would emerge from educational institutions or R&D departments, public enterprises, returned entrepreneurs or MNC employees from abroad. Now, when these sources of entrepreneurship emerges from here, they get motivated primarily by attending startup promotion activities. Plenty of them are going on in Bangalore. Weekend meetings, workshops, conferences, seminars, and all. It is then that they look for mentorship. And what we have understood is while technology mentoring is fairly easily available, or alternatively they do not look for technology mentoring, what is extremely hard to obtain is business mentorship in Bangalore. And ideas to prototype, technology mentoring is available or not needed. Whereas while taking it to the market, they really look for business mentoring, which is hard to get. Now, in some of them, they alternately go and join co-working space or get into accelerators or get into incubation centers. And they seek seed funds or sometimes they seek support from other startups. Now, seed funding is another major issue. Most of them, they feel that it is extremely difficult to get finance at this crucial stage. It is only when they are able to prove the product in the market that ants emerge to eat the sugar. Now, customer testing is the other important issue at this stage. This is called the emergence stage. That leads to when they are comfortable, successful, they move to the next stage, that is setting up the company and operations. Here too they need mentorship, and it is here that from seed funds, angel investors emerge, and large firms emerge as early adopters of the products. Educational institutions are important because they provide the talent, much required talent pool, and it is at this stage that these companies either register themselves as a company or come under the Limited Liability Partnership Act. But what we have observed in some contexts, that many of them, they preferred to register in Singapore rather than in India. And we got 2 kinds of reasons. One, because registration process is pretty cumbersome in India, whereas it's fairly easy in Singapore. This is one reason. Second reason, what they say is, when they register their company in Singapore, they get a better brand name, and raising resources becomes fairly easy. For these 2 reasons, they tell that they register their companies in Singapore but operate out of Bangalore. Now, the third stage, that is the scaling mode. The moment a startup is able to establish itself and able to capture the market increasingly, then it would look for scaling it up. It is there that Mr. Sampath Iyengar gets into the scene and his friends. Or VCs and private equities, they come on the scene, so they virtually get into the finance these firms for scaling it up. And alternatively, some startups, they get acquired by large firms. And education institutions again are important because if you have to scale it up, you need more talent. And some of them might go for IPO, that is the other possible route. Now, as far as Bangalore is concerned, what we have seen is Bangalore ecosystem is moderately mature and it is more vibrant as far as the first and the second phase are concerned. Whereas the third phase, it is still gaining ground. It has not yet been appealing or largely visible. So that is the reason why I said it is moderately mature and it will take some time to get fully mature. Finally, my broad observations, my broad observations, all the components of an ideal ecosystem do exist in Bangalore with varying degrees of quality, availability and interactions. Both public and private initiatives are active in the city, and in fact there are significant public-private partnerships emerging and operating. Or a Bangalore ecosystem is its